Hello and welcome aboard the Silverwind. I am Captain Tom, and we are joined by my co-host and intergalactic robot friend, Wilson. So he'll stay in the background. And today we're going to be going to Mimas. And I gotta say, it looks a whole lot like a particular famous object that has also been mistaken for a moon. So let me show you guys that in just a second. But real quick, Julian, hey, nice to see you too. Lionel, hey, look at that. Come on, Wilson. What you got for me today? Nice. Yes. So we are going to go to Saturn, one of its moons, and because of that, we're going to make sure that we phase jump over there so that we don't mess up anything. So let's go ahead and make sure we put in those coordinates correctly there, Wilson. We'll go ahead and go to Mimas. Let's see if that does the trick. That's it right there. Perfect. Okay, so you guys are going to see this here. So this is let's see. All right. So it's a little guy, very similar to what we covered yesterday. Let's see, or not yesterday, last week. Let me make sure we get locked into place here. It would be kind of embarrassing to get off course there. So, all right, yeah, we wouldn't want to fly into anything. That's why we phase jump, because I don't trust Wilson's driving, and everything around here is pretty fragile. We don't want to mess with the rings, we don't mess with these moons, nothing like that. So right here, this is Mimas, and it looks like, all right, we can see this really famous crater that it has. Now, I want to give you guys, show you guys a little image here. So this is basically what it looks like. So NASA has their own picture, and it looks like the Death Star. So we obviously came here at a little bit of a different angle, but you could see that massive crater on it. It's pretty cool. So this is actually one of the moons that's a bit closer to Saturn. Let me go ahead and take that off. But yeah, so it is the Death Star of our solar system. It's a pretty wonderful little object there. I wonder if that inspired Star Wars in any way, or if it's just purely a coincidence. I have to look into that. So let's go over some facts about Mimas. Now, this is once again, a very small moon. And as far as they can tell, it is solid ice. There's zero activity about it. Now, I do want to, let's see here. You know, we may have to go to another screen to take a look at that. But last time we talked about a different moon. So it was called Enceladus, and Enceladus had a very, very active core. Underneath its icy surface was basically a very active ocean, so active that you had geysers shooting out of that moon at about 800 miles per hour into space. That, of course, would all turn into ice once those geysers reached got out from the surface, and then that ice feeds into the belts of Saturn, which is a pretty cool thing. One of the little issues that we pointed out with it, though, is that it is very, very clean. And because it's so clean, the ice doesn't have like any space dust on it, which makes it very reflective and makes it very, very cold. This is Enceladus. And it's just kind of odd that something could be there for billions of years, being negative 330 degrees, not getting covered with any dust whatsoever, and have a very active core for that long. Now, the explanation that's typically given for this is that you have something called tidal heating. So this is the explanation. It's a theory that when an object like these moons are revolving around a really big planet like Saturn or Jupiter, well, their revolutions around or their orbits around these planets are not perfect circles. They actually go out a little bit and in a little bit. They're kind of like ovals as they orbit around these planets. And because of that, it causes stress on the planet's core, essentially friction from the different pull of gravity, and that creates heating and allows them to maintain active cores for billions of years despite being so small and so cold. And that should sap all the heat out of it over time and make them old, cold, and dead. And as a matter of fact, before we ever looked at anything out here in outer space, all the science agreed that all of these moons would in fact be old, cold, and dead, very much like our moon is. But in this situation right here, we have a moon about the same size. It's a little bit smaller than Enceladus. Mimas here, and it's closer to Saturn. And as a matter of fact, it has so much strain on it from the gravitational pull of Saturn that it's a more elongated, it's more squished than some of the other moons. But despite this, it has zero activity at its core. I mean, it is just a solid block of ice. So if the theory of tidal heating is what they use to explain the other moons, how is it that Mimas here isn't experiencing any tidal heating whatsoever? So this is one of those things that, if you believe in a materialist worldview, and you believe that these things have been here for billions upon billions of years, then it becomes a very difficult thing to reason this. Now, check this thing out. It is not, it didn't just drift over here yesterday. So this is something that is one of the most cratered objects in the solar system. It is up there. Massive amount of craters around this entire thing. It has clearly been here for quite some time. And so for them to basically explain it as being this close to Saturn, has no tidal heating whatsoever, but we're supposed to believe that Titan and Enceladus are active because of tidal heating, something's not quite measuring up there. Now, there is another explanation, although it might be to some extent reasonable to say that these things could be billions of years old and just a natural, a natural accident, right? A natural happy accident. They could be that. There's some reason for believing that, but it's not logical because there's another explanation that actually does fit all these puzzle pieces together just fine. And that's the idea that these things could have been put here not even that long ago by a creator, right? An intelligent designer for the universe. So we've talked a little bit about that before, about it has a lot of reason and logic that works with it. And it seems that it has a lot more, it is a better explanation for some of these things that we see out here than what some of the modern materialist science tries to explain it as. So interesting stuff. Believe what you want to believe, but yeah, there's some mysteries out there for the materialists. But aside from that, let's go ahead and we'll Wilson, we got I know you got it like off center because we're trying to get the view of Saturn, that whole thing. Could we make sure like Mimas is like right in the center? I'm pretty sure it'll get cut off in the when we go over to the library. So anyways, we'll go ahead and make that happen, hit that transition, and I'll see you guys in just a second. All right, so here we are, and perfect, Wilson. That was a great job. So let's talk a little bit about what we're going to be reading today, and we are going to be in chapter 11 of Genesis, and this is titled "The Tower of Babel." It's not just going to be about the Tower of Babel, but it's essentially the first half of this, and it's one of the more famous stories in the Bible, so it's a good title for it. But yeah, we're going to be covering that entire thing and talking about, basically last time we left off with basically the origin of nations, the genealogy of nations, and in that genealogy, it basically gives us an entire overview of going from the family of Noah to all the nations of the earth that the Israelites at the time that this book was written would have been familiar with. It would have created or given a link to the world as it was at that time. So that would have been, a few hundred or maybe a thousand more BC. So with that, and we can actually take that from written records and extrapolate from there, and it's actually done a lot to help with what you call secular science or secular archaeology to make the connections with all these ancient nations. And we also can see with modern genetics that in fact people do not have a common animal ancestor, they have a common human ancestor, and all people on the earth, their genetics can be tracked to one family. So that does actually line up with the text here pretty well. So that's pretty nice. And additional to that, what we're going to be covering today is going to be going back a little bit. And you're going to see that in the language here, because we go from one family speaking one language, and essentially, they believe in one God. And then how do we go from that to all the many nations where everyone's speaking different languages and believing in pretty much everything but God? So this is going to basically step in and explain that for us, because that is the mysterious part of Genesis chapter 10. Celtic Owl, Wilson for the win. Heck yeah, Wilson did good today. The tower, I've heard about that one plenty of times. Yes, it is a very famous story. So let's go ahead and let's make this thing happen. So let's go ahead. Let me see. Oh, yeah. You know what? I had some good pictures here. You know what? In reference to what I was talking about before, so we said that we pointed out that Mimas is, basically, littered with craters, one really massive one, and it is essentially a cold, dead moon. And yet, let me go ahead and give these pictures to you guys real quick. This is Enceladus. It's further away from Saturn. This is what I'm talking about. And these are the geysers that have been observed right here. So we got like a computer model right there. This is from NASA, by the way, and a nice little picture right here from NASA as well. And that's a very active celestial body out there, and they say it's 4 billion years old. That is, and it's also negative 330 degrees on its surface. So there's a little bit of contention there with that math, but anyways, I just want to make sure, kind of point that out. Those are really cool pictures. NASA's got some cool stuff. We can't exactly fly right up to these objects. We don't want to mess them up, and I don't trust Wilson's driving anyway. So let's go ahead, get into this story right here. I got a nice view. Ooh, the far view looks good. So let's go ahead and jump to that. All right, here we go. This is going to be Genesis 11, and starting, of course, at verse 1. At one time, all the people of the world spoke the same language and used the same words, which makes sense. As the people migrated to the east, they found a plain in the land of Babylonia and settled there. All right. So simple stuff. Basically, you would have the people after Noah's Ark. And this doesn't mean that literally every single person stayed with this group, but this would be the vast majority of people, right? There's potential that a couple people here and there didn't exactly go along with all this, but this is the vast majority of human beings are all staying together and not doing something that was spoken earlier to Noah by God. And that would be in chapter 9, and I'm pretty sure that's going to be verse 7. Where God says, now be fruitful and multiply and repopulate the earth, which means God is asking them to do kind of a scary thing here. This is one big family, one group of people. Have identified essentially one nation essentially, and God's telling them, hey, you guys need to go and disperse and repopulate everything. And that's probably scary in a world full of animals and all kinds of things that are out there that they would have to go and deal with, not knowing what's around the next corner. It's a big ask, and yet this was something God was going to guide them in. He's given them direction so they could trust God. But instead, they're choosing not to do that. And we're going to see the heart of people, how even though people were preserved after the flood, and people got to see what the consequences of turning their back on, as it says before the flood, there was not a single thing in their heart or their mind that was good anymore. And people got to see the consequences of that. That still doesn't change the issue of human nature. So let's go ahead and keep going. So let's get the next portion here. They began saying to each other, let's make bricks and harden them with fire. In this region, bricks were used instead of stone, and tar was used for mortar. Then they said, come, let's build a great city for ourselves with a tower that reaches into the sky. Some texts say, into the heavens. This will make us famous and keep us from being scattered all over the world. So they're basically telling God they're going to be on their own program. And this is them doubling down on their own pride. So there's a desire to be famous. They would like to build a city. And interestingly enough, a tower that's made of tar and brick, which means it would be waterproof. Now, that's an interesting detail in the text because God previously destroyed the world with water. And then he promised them that he would never do that again. So this could be maybe 3, 4, 5 generations down from, Noah's day. Maybe it's not that many generations down, but there's enough people getting around saying, you know what? We're not going to listen to God. And as a matter of fact, we're going to build this really massive tower. And in one of the things that I think, Sunday school type stuff kind of gets in the way with this is they make it sound like they're trying to build a bridge into heaven itself. If they were going to do that, they would build it on top of a mountain, and they're building it in a valley. So that would kind of be, ridiculous if they were trying to actually build a bridge to heaven through this tower. They're just trying to build a very tall monument that would essentially be praise and worship of their own ingenuity and of their own ability to basically tell God that they're not going to listen to him and they're going to be on their own program. So this is basically doubling down their own pride and building it out of something that's waterproof, which is just an extra little dig against God right there to say, hey, you destroyed our stuff last time, you're not going to be able to destroy this. Well, that we'll see how that goes for them, but that's essentially what they're doing. And so something has happened between Noah's time, where they're all worshiping God, and now. And the best explanation for what is going on is probably going back to chapter 10 a little bit. If you go into the middle of the text, it says that Cush also had an ancestor of Nimrod. And we know that the name Nimrod, and this is someone who was a famous warrior, famous for hunting, right? Which meant he probably slayed something that'd be akin to, like a monster, something like a great animal or something that gave him a reputation as being a mighty warrior. And then he was also someone who basically had a rebellious nature toward God. So this very much lines up with the character of Gilgamesh. It may or may not be Gilgamesh or who Gilgamesh is about. But if it is, it would kind of make sense. Gilgamesh was a builder of cities in this area. He was a king. He hunted a great monster and basically stood up to the gods, which all the people were afraid to do. And so what this could be is a situation where you have a ruler very similar to this, basically leading the people away from God and to do their own thing. And so this is kind of the culmination of that. And spoke earlier about how human nature hasn't changed. So God promised he wasn't going to flood the earth ever again. If he's going to hold to that promise, that means he has to keep the world from getting to the point where the hearts and minds of all people are devoid of anything good anymore, which means he's going to have to intervene before things ever get that far. And you're going to see from here on out in the story, God is going to go through a great deal of effort to directly intervene in a lot of different ways to put a stop to evil, to curtail evil, and to frustrate the plans of the wicked, or at least at the minimum, human pride. And so that's what we're going to start seeing happening here. So I think that kind of covers that part right there. All right, let's go ahead and we're going to read another little chunk right here and see what happens next. But the Lord came down to look at the city and the tower the people were building. Look, he said, the people are united and they all speak the same language. After this, nothing they set out to do will be impossible for them. Come, let's go down and confuse the people with different languages. Then they won't be able to understand one another. So this is really interesting because God knows everything, knows the future, he's omnipresent. He was able to create the stars by just speaking them into existence. And yet it says that he went down to see the tower that they were building. Now, I think this speaks a lot to the nature of God in both his character and other things the Bible describes about him after the fact. So there's not a lot of context right here, but we do see later on in the Bible it makes some things very clear about who God is. And there's essentially the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. That's something that's kind of revealed more towards the New Testament. It's hinted at a lot in the Old Testament. And that's the idea that no one has seen the Father, right? If anyone were to stand in the presence of the Father, then they would be, because they are sinful, because they are not fully good and they have attached their nature to evil, evil can't stand in the presence of God, no differently than darkness can't stand in the presence of light. Darkness is just wiped out when light shows up. And it's the same way with God's presence, or at least the Father's presence. And because of that, if a person is caught in that moment and they're standing before the Father, they would be undone. There's actually a prophet later on in the Bible who has a dream that he's standing in the presence of the Father. And that's the first thing he says. He says, I am undone. And then God doesn't do that, but it was a dream, of course, so it's a little bit different circumstances. But going back to this, so there's this interesting idea about God, how no person has seen him, and yet we're seeing these places in the Old Testament where God's showing up, walking around with people. I mean, he was walking, talking with Adam and Eve, walking around here. He's going to show up. He's going to wrestle someone later. And so what is this? And this would be what is commonly referred to as the angel of the Lord, or just the Lord at times, and that would be the Son of God, right? This is the personal aspect of God, with the humility to be able to stand and talk amongst us. And this is who Jesus claimed to be, right? So, and then of course you have the Holy Spirit is something, another part of, it's fully God, but not God in his entirety, if that makes sense, as all of these three things are. So, and if you want to if you guys would like to get more into that, you have any questions about it, please ask. But saying all of that, God is choosing to see the things that people are doing, see it with its own eyes, so to speak, instead of just relying on the fact that he already knows it, or he knows the future, or that sort of thing, which I think speaks to the nature of God as being just. When people are really messing up, he's just showing up and be like, I am going to include myself as a witness to this thing. And there's actually a city later on in a few chapters that gets up to doing some really bad things. And once again, God says, I've heard the cries coming out of the city. Basically, he says he knows everything that's happening here, but he goes to it personally to witness it himself. And I think that speaks to his justice and who he is. So which I think is really interesting. All right, so we got that little segment right there, and then the language part about this is really interesting. So God is saying that the language is key. If he can just frustrate the language, then they're not going to be able to do anything. And of course that makes sense. If only your family was officially now speaking a unique and a different language than everybody else, you wouldn't be able to work with everybody else. You'd probably think they were crazy, get frustrated, and leave. Which is essentially the goal of this. But I do find this interesting that God says that if he doesn't do this, there won't be anything they won't be able to accomplish. And I think that just speaks to, almost a sense of like, he's very proud of what he created. He created something that was very good, something that was very capable. Like, people are very capable of a lot of things, and they could do great things, especially when we work together. And God recognizes that. He recognizes what he created and how awesome it is. And even he's saying, like, listen, I gotta throw a wrench in here because I know what I made, and I know I made something pretty awesome. And but they're going to use that awesome part that I put into them to be able to accomplish anything as they work together. They're going to use it for evil. So unfortunately, he has to give them a reason to be separated so that they fulfill what he was asking them to do in the first place, go about the whole world, but also to put an end to this, essentially one-way trip into giving into all of their pride, right? He's got to humiliate them. And this had to be very humiliating. So there's stuff that linguists, I'm not a linguist, but linguists have studied this stuff, or studying language, looking at this story. Most modern linguists think that all languages came from one language, and they believe that language is something that humans couldn't have invented. A lot of them believe that. And the reason for that is that, there's a lot of expressions, universal expressions, such as, like raspberry noise or whatever. Like there's things that we universally understand in the sounds that we make, and can communicate with those sounds without actually using words. And if that were the case, then wouldn't all languages be using these common sounds that are essentially universal to help speak their language? But we don't see that when we study language. We see a very sophisticated set of sounds with meaning, information that couldn't have come about through slow, small changes over time in the things that the sounds humans were making. It had to come about as one big complex idea already ready to go, and linguists have a hard time understanding how people could have invented that, or how that could have evolved into human speech. It makes sense that if God created people, He gave them a language, and since God is the one who invented language, he will be the one who then could create many more languages and have them all speaking that. So yeah, I don't know, interesting stuff. I'm sure linguists out there would probably have a little bit more to say on that, but definitely a field of study that would be pretty interesting. Okay, so I think that's all I really have on that part right there. So like I said, slow me down if you guys have any questions. If not, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next part. In that way, the Lord scattered them all over the world, and they stopped building the city. That is why the city was called Babel, because that is where the Lord confused the people with different languages. In this way, he scattered them all over the world. So I think that right there is the basically just talking about what we kind of already know. God's plan succeeded. So let's, I did have one note here. I want to try and get to it real quick because it's really fascinating that there was a historian, a Roman historian, who claimed that he had seen this city. I want to make sure, kind of have some long string of notes here. May not be able to find it. I want to give you the exact name, but you know what? Maybe it's not in this set of notes. That's all right. You know, I'll find it for next time. But there is a Roman historian, and I wish I could give you his name because I didn't write it down. I don't know why I didn't write it down. But he claimed to have seen the Tower of Babel and claimed that it existed. So it is possible that this city, this abandoned city, this half-built tower, however far they got into its construction, was left abandoned for the ancient world to see for a long time and would stand as some kind of, or could have stood as some kind of lesson, but people are hard-hearted anyways, or hard-headed, I guess. So yeah, so it was kind of an interesting detail that of course at some point in time surely it was buried or destroyed or that sort of thing. But yeah, I think there's some archaeologists that feel like they found the location of where it could have been. So those are some interesting studies to do on the side if you feel so inclined. But well, let's see this. So, Julian, some language sentences are structured differently, which makes it tough to learn. And, you know, and that's very, very true. Just the very structure, like language is such a complex thing. The very structure of it and, you know, how, like when the verb is and when you're talking about what kind of nouns and that sort of thing, it's, yeah, it's a very, I think we got, let's see, Wilson. I think Lake swallowed a toy. I'll take care of that. Oh, she got it out. All right. Well, that's beautiful. Wilson, would you mind cleaning it up? Oh, I don't care that you don't have hands. All right, fine. I'll deal with it later. Okay. Anyways, well, that's what we get for Wilson buying animals and bringing them on board. So, anyways, let's go ahead and get to the next part. So the next part takes a strong shift away from the Tower of Babel. We're now going to go into another little I guess lineage, genealogy. It's not too long. I'm probably not going to read the whole thing, but I do want to read the beginning of it and the end of it, because this is going to be talking about, or at least introducing, one of the biggest heroes of the Bible, one of the most famous people of the Bible, and not just the Bible. I mean, this is one of the most famous characters of the entire world. So yeah, let's go ahead and get into that, because that is all part of chapter 11. Make sure I hit this right. Easy day. All right, this is the account of Shem's family. 2 years after the great flood, when Shem was 100 years old, he became the father of Arphaxad. After the birth of Arphaxad, Shem lived another 500 years and had other sons and daughters. You know, I am going to read through this because it's very interesting. You can see the decline, or hear the decline in age, right? So we'll go through this quickly. When Arphaxad was 35 years old, he became the father of Shelah. After the birth of Shelah, Arphaxad lived another 403 years and had other sons and daughters. When Shelah was 30 years old, he became the father of Eber. After the birth of Eber, Shelah lived another 403 years and had other sons and daughters. When Eber was 34 years old, he became the father of Peleg. After the birth of Peleg, Eber lived another 430 years and had more sons and daughters. When Peleg was 30 years old, he became the father of Reu, which sounds like a Street Fighter. After the birth of Reu, Peleg lived another 209 years. We're seeing it drop, and had other sons and daughters. When Reu was 32 years old, he became the father of Sherug. which is a weird name. After the birth of Shirug, Ryu lived another 207 years and had other sons and daughters. When Shirug was 30 years old, he became the father of Nahor. After the birth of Nahor, Shirug lived another 200 years and had other sons and daughters. When Nahor was 29 years old, he became the father of Terah. After the birth of Terah, Nahor lived another 119 years and had other sons and daughters. When Terah was 70 years old, he had become the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. All right, that was a lot. But one of the interesting things you can see there, and that's about, I think it's about like 9 generations. You really see, so God had promised that he was going to shorten the age of human beings. And when you start off with Adam and Eve, who would have had a perfect body, flawless, there would have been nothing that was, no defects, nothing that was, started off any kind of entropy or anything in their bodies. So it took a long time for them to die, and subsequently, after the flood, we see the ages start to drop off dramatically, and then a few generations down from that, it drops off even more to the area which God promised that it was going to be limited to. And you could say that has to do with a lot of different factors. The world was very different after the flood, wasn't as lush, wasn't as, it didn't have all of the what do you call it, paradise qualities that it once had before. It became a bit more of a more difficult place to live in, and because of that, that also contributed to the lowering of the age of humans. And so then we get to something a bit more reasonable. There will be people, obviously, in the Old Testament who did live a long time. That's generally because they're blessed by God. Otherwise, people are going to start falling into this less than 100-year kind of time frame, which we're a bit more used to. And then we have a little bit more because we're introducing these characters. Abram. Now, if you're not familiar with Abraham, his name started off as Abram, and so God changes it later. That's it shouldn't be too much of a surprise to people. But Abraham is the character I was referring to earlier because he is one of the most famous figures in world history. You have both Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. All are Abrahamic religions, and these religions they honestly are the biggest group of population on the earth. If you combine all three of those, the majority of people fall into an Abrahamic religion in their belief system. And so it's, kind of a big deal. A lot of people know who this guy is. So we're going to talk about him, and we'll uncover his story here. So let's go ahead and start reading it then. This is the account of Terah's family. Terah was the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran was the father of Lot. But Haran died in Ur of the Chaldeans, the land of his birth, while his father Terah was still living. I'm starting and pausing a lot right here. So I want to make sure you guys have this picture correctly because it's very, very important. Haran is considered traditionally that he was the oldest son. All right, this is going to be very, very important because the next text is going to reveal some stuff. So he's the oldest son, and you have Abram and Nahor after that. And between Abram and Nahor, let me say this. So Haran has a son. His name is Lot. Haran dies, and you're going to see Abram kind of almost adopts Lot, kind of like in acts as a father figure for Lot's life. So I mean, if your brother passed away and he had a son, then you would want to take care of that son, which would be his nephew. So you're going to see Lot and Abram kind of doing a lot of traveling together, and the story kind of evolves between those two characters. So just keep in mind that relationship between them. And then I want to make sure. So with that said, we'll go ahead and get into this next part right here. Makes it make more sense. Meanwhile, Abram and Nahor both married. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. Milcah and her sister Iscah were daughters of Nahor's brother Haran. But Sarai was unable to become pregnant and had no children. Okay, so we've come to a part in the text that is it's going to require a little bit of explanation, but understanding this is going to help you through the rest of the story a lot. So it's clear and obvious that Nahor is marrying his niece. right? So this is his brother's daughter, Milcah. And so we have this other character here who's Iscah, and then she's basically never brought up again. So this is the only time that Iscah is mentioned, as far as I was able to find. And then we have Sarai here, and it is a Jewish custom, or at least it is one of the Jewish traditions, to say that Iscah and Sarai are the same person, which would mean that Abram also married his niece. Now, this sounds really, really weird to a modern audience, but you have to understand that back then, basically keeping in the family was very commonplace. I mean, especially if you're talking about starting with Noah's family, and they're populating, of course, amongst themselves. And as they split off into tribes and groups from there, then they would probably be keeping it somewhat close in family. And we do see later on, you're going to have Abram's descendants, a couple of them, Isaac and Jacob, are going to go to Nahor's family to find a wife. So these would be their cousins that they end up marrying. Like I said, to a modern audience, that kind of almost sounds funny. But once again, when we study genetics, a lot of the issues with close relations nowadays would be, and the reason a lot of deformities happen, I think I've talked a little bit about this before when we talked about Cain, and that's that the gene pool is really, really shallow. There's too many similar genes. There's not enough variety, and that causes problems whenever new DNA is being formed, with the sperm and the egg and everything. So if you actually have a large gene pool, I mean, you have a lot of recessive and dominant genes in there, then you have enough to pick from and there isn't an issue. This is why Adam and Eve didn't really have any issues, even though Eve is literally a genetic copy of Adam. The only difference would be the chromosome. God literally took Adam's bone and made Eve from it, which means that she has the same DNA as him. But their DNA, their gene pool is completely maxed out and full. Like, they have the genetics and all the recessive traits and everything for everything that you see today, right? Which means they had a lot of genetic information in there. And as a population essentially spreads out and splits off, those recessive, they lose dominant genes. Those recessive genes become more prominent, and you start getting different appearances. And this is how we get all the different appearances for the animals that we see and humans as well. As humans travel across the world, different recessive genes are brought up, and one group going over to Europe or going towards Africa, going towards, China and that sort of thing, as they're migrating and moving away from one another, they're taking different genes away from one another that then the population is losing that genetic information. So eventually the Bible is going to, in Leviticus, have some rules about, hey, don't have relations with close relatives kind of thing. So it's going to get more detailed that, but God hasn't given that instruction yet. And so this was very common for their time. And the tradition with the Jewish tradition that, let's see here, Iscah and Sarai are the same person, goes to the fact that, or is really interesting, because Abram later claims that Sarai is his sister. He says that he says that we have the same father, but not the same mother, which would be describing a half sister. Well, if this is in fact, Iscah, who would be his father's granddaughter on his brother's side, then when she marries him, she would be essentially a daughter-in-law, which would mean that she would be his sister, right? Or calling her his sister at that point would be appropriate to say, even though she's technically his niece. So, So anyways, that is definitely a strong possibility. I can't say for sure one way or another, but just letting you guys know that interpretation of this family right here is out there. So, and I think it's legitimate, but anyways. So with that, a problem is brought up, and this problem is very, very important. It's going to drive a lot of Abram's story. And that's that Sarai is unable to get pregnant. She's unable to have children. And that's a big deal. It's a big problem. So let's go ahead. We're going to read out the rest of this text right here, and then we'll wrap up after that. One day, Terah took his son, Abram, his daughter-in-law, Sarai. Remember what I said about that? No longer would she be a granddaughter if this is Iscah. This would now be his daughter-in-law. His son Abram's wife, and his grandson Lot, his son Haran's child, and moved away from Ur of the Chaldeans. He was headed for the land of Canaan, but they stopped at Haran. This is Haran the place, and settled there. Terah lived for 205 years and died while still in Haran. So we find out later on in the story that the reason that they move from Ur to, at least towards Canaan, is because God told Abram specifically that he wanted him to go there. And so Abram basically takes his family, his father comes with, and they start heading over there. And in probably all likelihood, the reason they stop in Haran and don't move on from there is probably because the father got sick. And so he was there until he passed away. And then we'll get to see what happens after that. So Abram is on a quest essentially to go where God has told him to go, which is the land of Canaan. And that's very important because remember, we covered before, the Canaanites are cursed. The Canaanites are cursed to essentially lose their land because of what they would eventually end up doing, which was some really, really evil stuff. And God is already creating the circumstances for Abram and his descendants to eventually take that land and have a claim to that land. And that's what's happening right now. And with that, that's basically the end of chapter 11 and where we are with that story right now. Yeah, so it's pretty interesting stuff there. Let's go ahead and get this. Let's go back to the bridge here. So we're going to transition here. If you guys have any questions, type them into the chat and we'll talk about it in just a second. All right. So we're basically going to head back to Earth. Yeah. What do you guys think? You could put it in the comments. You can, under the video, or type it in the chat right now. What do you guys think about the Tower of Babel and God's response to that? Because I don't know. I think it's very interesting. Like his decision is just so subtle. Like, why not just change the language instead of going down there? I just find it interesting that instead of trying to correct the behavior, punish them for their pride, no, you guys are going to be humble or anything like that, he just essentially tricks them all, which I don't know. What do you guys think about it? That says about God's character? Let's go ahead. If you guys have anything to say on that, you guys will put that in while I get this back to Earth without crashing into the sun or anything, because that would be bad. Let's see. I think here we go. That should do the trick. Let's see if it works, Wilson. All right. This hasn't failed before, but I probably shouldn't have said that out loud. Right, here we go. Ah, beautiful. All right, very, very nice. Let's see. And we have arrived, so I can let you guys off here. There we go, lock into place. Be embarrassing to crash into Earth. Okay, so with that, we'll be picking up. We'll be basically staying along Abram's journey, who eventually becomes Abraham. Staying on that journey for a while. It's very wild. Understanding Abram's story, I just say this, understanding his story is so key and pivotal to understanding a lot of what goes on in the Bible. So we've covered a lot of important things. I mean, the first 11 books of the Bible, 11 books of Genesis, have some really wild and really important stuff in it. That foundation has been laid, and now Abram is going to lay another foundation for everything else to be built on in this story. And one of the reasons we're following him, just a heads up, so earlier in the text, there was a promise that someone would defeat the Satan, right? The serpent who deceived Adam and Eve, who brought sin into the world, and all the destruction and nastiness that's happened to people and all of God's creation has been promised to be defeated by someone born from the woman, right? And so we're going to follow down his line, and we're going to eventually get to that hero here. And yeah, so it's going to be a wild ride getting to that point. So let's see here. I think the many languages that we have are neat. I think so too. We got some great languages. Let's see here. I agree with Julian. Very, very nice. You know what? I gotta say, I don't know about you guys. I have only ever truly learned one language. like I want to understand. I've tried to learn French, tried to learn Spanish in school. That didn't work out so well. But yeah, I think it's just something really enriching. It's what little I've tried to learn about other things. Like when I was trying to learn French, I can speak very little French. It's just really cool, like the different ideas about how to express, the thoughts that you have in your head, and that the better you are at articulating yourself and expressing those thoughts, the better you are at being able to actually problem solve and think through things. So it's language is a very powerful tool. I would say that is the one thing, probably the greatest gift. Some people say, or had these little memes or whatever, like God's great gift to man was fire. I think God's great gift to man was language, because that alone sets us apart from all of the animals. That's my opinion on that. I think that's what allows us to be as intelligent as we are, and a pretty phenomenal gift at that. So I don't think that animals speak a secret language. I don't think that they can develop it on their own. It does make sense that it's a complicated system that has to be given to us by an outside source. So some street level Spanish. Nice. There's some sayings and terms that don't exist or would translate weird in English. And that's one of the issues with translating this stuff. So this was written in like ancient Hebrew. And there were no vowels in ancient Hebrew when they wrote it down like that. Those vowels were assumed. So you had to already have some kind of inside knowledge. So there's definitely some, I've already come across a little bit. There's some translation stuff that you have to look into when studying the Bible, because you have to understand, well, what does that word even mean? What's really being said here? And then how does that affect the context, right? And so we'll come across some of those and talk about them more. But fascinating stuff. I think that having a knowledge about the Bible and what it says, I think it helps everybody. Super important. So anyways, I guess with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up right here. We stayed under the hours. That's very, very nice. Got the same song from last time. I really like it. Stars in the Sky seems really, really appropriate. Be sure to check out those artists in the description. And also, hey, if you are interested in reading a simple and fun book, I wrote one. Got the link of it in the description. Mercy for the Fallen, Legacy of Hope. Like I said, I can promise you two things: is both a simple and fun read. So if you're interested in that, you can check that out. And with that, I'm pretty sure we're done here. So Wilson, if you want to go ahead and hit that outro, and I'll catch you guys next time.
I got lost at night under the stars up in the sky. Directions hard to find under the stars up in the sky. I got lost at night under the stars up in the sky. Directions hard to find under the stars up in the sky. I don't know where to take this, I don't wanna break this. We're living in the moment, living in the moment. Your head is on my shoulder, but never getting older. Baby, it's you and I. Yeah, we're stars in the sky. Oh, you and I. Yeah, we're stars in the sky. I know you'll follow me. I don't know where to take this, I don't wanna break this. We're living in the moment, living in the moment. Your head is on my shoulder, we're never getting older. Baby, it's you and I.